Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Zach Langway, class of 2009 and Vice President for Alumni Relations at Brown. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with the great class of 1991 this evening. We have an incredible panel tonight that includes friends and colleagues and fellow alumni, and a topic that couldn't be more timely for discussion. What I love about events like these is that they keep us connected, not only to each other, but to the intellectual core of the Brown experience. Conversations like these bring us together both for community and also to continue our lifelong learning. Because while, of course, we care so deeply about that very special place up on College Hill, Brown is so much more than just a place, right? Brown is the thirst for knowledge that brings us into a classroom or a lab and fuels us for the rest of our lives. Brown is the desire for impact that propels us through those gates forward and out into the world. And Brown is a sense of belonging that we feel when we meet fellow Brownonians out there in the real world, regardless of generation or geography, someone who reminds us of our roommates, our teammates, our classmates from our own time on campus. Community and connection don't happen accidentally, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how essential alumni volunteers are in keeping all of our connections to Brown so strong. Volunteers conceptualize and plan and promote and implement activities like these for your class, but also for our local regional clubs around the world, our affinity communities, and more. And so a heartfelt thank you to Tracy, Andy, Jim, and all of our class of 1991 leaders and our extraordinary panelists for your work to bring us and keep us together. So with that, thank you for being here, and on with the show. Please welcome your class of 1991 Vice President for Activities and tonight's moderator, Tracy Skronik. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach, and welcome, class of 91. It's so good to be doing this and to have you here. I'm Tracy Skronik. I'm one of your class officers, and professionally, I work in education. I work for the New York City Public Schools and currently working on a project to bring International Baccalaureate to 12 schools in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. If you're familiar with the geography of Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy is one of the underserved communities in our city. And so my mission at work is very much aligned on the K-12 level with the great panelists we have tonight. So I'm very privileged to be able to introduce to you our panel. I'm going to give you very brief snippets of their bios because they're extensive. But starting with Dr. Suzanne Rivera, you might remember her as one of our senior orators at our commencement in 1991. She has since served in many different roles in higher education and is currently the president of Macalester College in Minneapolis, St. Paul. She's responsible for numerous initiatives to increase access to higher education for students from historically excluded backgrounds. And we have Dr. Prudence Carter, who is currently a professor at Brown University. She is currently the Sarah and Joseph Jr. Dowling Professor of Sociology, and her research focuses on understanding and addressing persistent racial, class, and gender inequalities in education and society. Welcome to Prudence. And now we have Dr. Lamont Gordon. He is the executive director of College Visions. He himself is a first-generation college graduate and a strong believer in the transformative power of education. He's dedicated his career to creating pathways to college for students from underserved communities. Welcome, Lamont. And then finally, Russell Carey, who is our Executive Vice President of Planning and Policy at Brown, works closely with President Paxson and members of the community to ensure effective university-wide efforts in planning and policy in keeping with the university's overall mission. So welcome to the four fantastic class of 91 panelists. I am very grateful to them for being here tonight and very excited to hear and discuss this very timely topic. Just a quick note on how we're going to conduct this. We're running through a very brief question first, just to sort of get us started. Each of the four panelists will answer. 30 seconds on this one, guys. And then Prudence is actually going to give us a quick historical perspective on the Supreme Court, pending Supreme Court decision and what it kind of the context historically. And then I'll direct one question to each of the panelists and we'll sort of have a discussion. At the very end, hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. So feel free to put them in the chat and we'll be monitoring them and bringing them out at the end. Okay. So the first question and you're each going to do this. We are going to start, I think, with Lamont on this one, is just simply, what is one thing specific to the makeup of Brown student body when we were there that enhanced your college experience?
Thank you. I'd say, of course, having a critical mass of students of color on campus meant the world to me. But what was most, what I most really appreciated was the diversity within the diversity, right? I grew up in a poor Black community, and I therefore had a very limited idea of what was possible for me as a young Black man. But to come to this campus and see Black students with so many different interests and backgrounds, there were artists, there were engineers, all sorts of interests. That sort of diversity within that community had a big impact on me and my experience at Brown.
Thank you. And Sue.
Hi, good to be with you all. I have a kind of a similar perspective to Lamont in the sense that I was a Pell Grant financial aid student from an immigrant family. When I got to Brown, I just thought, wow, there are all different kinds of people here, and not just in terms of their personal identities, but also what people were interested in, right? There were piccolo players and rugby players and people really into chemistry and people into social justice activism. And the thing that united everybody there was a kind of creativity and being smart. And so if that was your distinguishing thing in high school, that no longer was the thing that made you special. And so we all had to find other ways to express our specialness, because just being a good student wasn't the defining characteristic anymore. And I found that really energizing, and it helped me to grow.
Thank you. Prudence.
Well, hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Well, I tell you, I was trying to run away from the insularity of my own community in the de facto segregated South. I mean, it was just, and Brown opened my eyes to a world that I had no idea existed. Students from all 50 states, from all over the world, from, scores of countries. And I also, I was just like most of us, I was that nerdy kid. So to come to Brown and also be able to do the arts, do math, do economics, and, play and have fun. I never thought I would come back to Brown, but it was so good to me that I am back. And so I do say that there's something about in the air about the place that really drew me to it.
Thank you. And Russell.
Thank you. I would say just being on this panel brings back the same feelings of being around people who have so many different perspectives and experiences and things to offer. And I'm also being a little intimidated and not quite sure why I'm in that group. So I'm really mostly just reliving all those feelings right now. But I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Feeling much of the same, Russell. We're there with you. Okay, so we're going to go now to a quick, we're going to bring up 2 slides, and Prudence is just going to take us through that historical perspective.
Well, yeah, thank you, Tracy. So just for those of you who are not familiar with the background of the court case that the Supreme Court heard on October 31st of 2022, there are 2 cases that were united to challenge affirmative action in higher education, and they were brought by this organization called Students for Fair Admissions, that's led by a person, a conservative ideologue named Edward Bloom, who is often referred to as a legal entrepreneur. He's gone across the country challenging higher ed issues. He was behind the Fisher case. And UT Austin, he's been behind a number of the challenges to affirmative action in the United States. So these 2 cases, one is against a private university, and one is a case that's brought against a public university. Harvard's case is being tried as a challenge to or in a violation of Title VI. And for those of you, many of you probably know that Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act actually forbids any entity that receives federal funds from discrimination on the basis of color, race, gender, and so forth. And then there's the UNC case, and UNC is the public flagship university for North Carolina. As a public institution, it is being held to the standards of the 14th Amendment. And so is that the petitioners are alleging that the University of North Carolina is violating the 14th Amendment in terms of equal protection by public institutions by showing some favor and disproportionate favor against Asian and white students in favor of Black and Latinx and Indigenous students. In the Harvard case is that there's the idea, particularly the plaintiffs or petitioners are Asian American students who are really challenging Harvard's kind of non-academic factors in their admissions process. The idea that these subjective standards that they're using are discriminatory against Asian American students. So those are the petitioners. Of course, the universities are arguing that they're actually just applying what the court has sanctioned already, that what it has allowed, and that's the holistic reviews that allows the university admissions to include both academic and non-academic factors, to think about not only students' social location, their social identities, and their various, but to think about the things that they do, how to create a diversified and representative class that, like I said, like what we appreciate here at Brown, students come from all 50 states and all over the world, do different kinds of things in terms of their extracurriculars. And that race is just one of those things of diversity and the constellation of the things that make us so multifaceted. The universities are also saying that when they opened up, so to speak, in the 1960s and such, that really the practice of affirmative action is about responding to what we know has been historically entrenched structural inequality and systemic racism that continues to block equal educational opportunities today. And so that we have to do things more proactively and intentionally if we're going to rectify these kind of really long and enduring historical forces. So those are kind of the basis of the two arguments in protection of the practices that are already being that are in place in the two universities. But of course, the petitioners are saying that those practices are discriminatory, and they're certainly disproportionately laying the burden on Asian and white students in North Carolina, and at Harvard as Asian American students. So that's the kind of backdrop of the case. The next slide that we want to think about and maybe have a conversation about is that what we don't know. We have no idea what the Supreme Court is going to do or how broad the decision will be when it comes down sometime at the end of the term. What we do know is that there could have some severe implications. For those of you who followed the Prop 209 case in California, when it came out in the early 2000s, we saw what happened in the University of California system. It was a precipitous drop in the number of historically underrepresented students who were attending the flagship universities in California, in the law schools, the medical schools. So we know that this can potentially have, if they rule for the petitioners, we know that it could have an adverse effect on the actual numbers of historically underrepresented students who are coming. But we also don't know, based on how the cases were argued, how it might affect financial aid, specifically if we think about donor-defined scholarships that are supposed to be given or allocated to students from certain backgrounds. So that's something that we're concerned about. And we're also concerned about how that may impact kind of the affinity group activities on campus. So there are theme houses and groups, and some of those organizations are given funds by the university. So but a big one is how it may adversely affect talent identification, recruitment, and other things. So there's a lot for us to be kind of anxious about in terms of universities trying to play their role in the ecosystem of providing equal educational opportunity. Could this be a setback is the big question. And if it is a setback in terms of how practice is now implemented, the big question is, well, what should we do if we still want to subscribe to the mission of making sure and ensuring that higher education is accessible to many and to all of us in the democracy in this society, and that it's representative of all people.
Thank you so much, Prudence. We all appreciate that as a backdrop for the discussion for tonight. And Yeah, I think these questions are just the beginning, obviously. And so I'm excited to see where our conversation takes us. We are going to start with you, Russell, just to give us some perspective on Brown specifically. So the question is, what is Brown's current stated mission on diversity? How long has it been in place, and why is it important to the institution?
So thanks for that, Tracy. And I think this will really pick up on a lot of things that Prudence was just framing for us. So I think one thing I would start with is saying, and I think this is hopefully almost goes without saying, but I will say it, that diversity, equity, inclusion are core values that really define the Brown community and the Brown experience. I think that's what you would expect from our time as undergraduates, and in my experience, having not really left really at all and been here pretty much that whole time and had most of my career in higher education administration in different roles at Brown. I think what I've observed over the past however long a period of time it is really just dramatic, what I would describe as dramatic improvement, with still lots of room to grow and improve further. And I could certainly describe a lot of things that have happened over that time period. And I think particularly beginning when Ruth Simmons became president, began to create, and not just at Brown, but this happened at lots of institutions, more administrative leadership and faculty structures around equity, inclusion, and diversity. For example, really creating positions with responsibility at senior levels and cabinet levels. And we now have a vice president for institutional equity and diversity. But I think what's probably most relevant is thinking about the last 5 to 8 years, particularly under President Paxton's leadership. We have, as you probably are familiar with, a diversity inclusion action plan that was established in 2016, which now has a phase 2 that was not a new plan, but building on the foundation of the original plan in 2021. There's a lot of information about that on the website, which I really would encourage people to read. But I think it has had a really positive impact on the campus in terms of establishing very specific goals, and goals on which we have reported annually and made a significant amount of progress around. For example, what at the time I think was a pretty ambitious goal of doubling the percentage of historically underrepresented groups on the faculty. And that's a goal that in the last year has been met. So going from about 8% to about 16%. We've seen increases across all student populations in terms of diversity. Very concerned exactly for all the reasons Prudence described about how this case could set that back, but there have been tremendous gains. 2 other things I would mention. I think that the plans that we've had in place, in addition to having very specific goals and a lot of investment associated with those goals, have probably even more than that created a much stronger, in my view, culture and sense of accountability, because every administrative and every academic department has to have a diversity inclusion action plan for their department, which is submitted annually. It gets feedback and is part of the overall effort in this area. And I think that has had, in some areas more than others, and as you would imagine, some departments are more receptive to it than others, but has definitely had the effect of creating a culture of both action and accountability throughout the institution. And I do think that culture is extremely important. And I think going back to where Prudence was, I think, setting up this conversation, I think one of the significant fears about the case is that culture being pushed back and then taking however many years and different efforts to catch up again. And I think that, but I would also say that, as I started with, being the core values that these are, that there's a really very strong commitment to maintaining that. And the case is not going to change the direction, the mission, the culture, the values of the institution. It may impact things that we do to live those every day, but it won't change the core of what is Brown in this area.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add to that? He's sort of the expert on that one. Okay, so we'll go to Lamont. We have a question for you on, just in general, what might the expected Supreme Court decision do to change the makeup of the student body at Brown or really any other undergraduate institution? And how do we expect that to compare with historical data in terms of racial demographics, household income, and first generation status?
Yeah, this case is really a continuation of a decades-long backlash to efforts to diversify college campuses, which began in the 60s and 70s within the context of the civil rights movement, where you had Black student activists and their allies pushing schools to admit more Black students, hire more Black professors, and add Black studies to the curriculum. And by the way, you had a similar movement going on largely in California with the Chicano student activists. But because of these efforts, higher education looks drastically different today. In the 70s, 80% of all college students were white. Today, that's like 55%. And so there really has been a sea change on campus, at least in terms of the numbers. Now, there are still issues around equity and inclusion, but in terms of the numbers of low income, first generation and students of color, it's a very different picture. So that's the sort of the one thing I'll say. And this change did not happen by itself, right? It took both pressure on institutions, and then colleges really had to develop a commitment to diversifying their campuses and to develop intentional strategies to recruit and admit and retain students, underrepresented students. This case threatens to limit the tools and strategies that colleges have to recruit, admit and retain students. And again, we don't know what the outcome will be, but it's not completely hypothetical because I think at least 10, aside from this case, 10 states across the country have already banned the use of race in college admissions in public universities. Prudence talked about California. Immediately when those bans went into effect, we saw a huge drop in the number of Black and Latino students. So the consequences are real and the stakes are high. One last point I'll make is often when we have these conversations around higher education, we think about the Browns, the Harvards, the well-known schools, the sort of elite, highly selective schools. And I think, those schools hold a lot of space in the public imagination around what higher education looks like. The reality is those schools serve a small fraction of college students in this country. Most college students, and this is particularly true for students of color, low income and first generation students, attend 2-year and 4-year public universities. And even if the court rules against the plaintiffs and allows race to be continued to use in college admissions, even if that happens, there are still major issues that are preventing us from having greater equity and access in higher education. State funding has not kept up with the cost of education. At the federal level, the Pell Grant, which used to, when it was established, covered 80% of a 4-year public institution, now covers like 30%. And so the cost of public higher education is being shifted to students and families and is unaffordable and unattainable. So I just want to make that point because it's not just about how can highly selective schools maintain diversity. The larger question is how can we make sure that higher education is accessible and affordable to all students, particularly low-income, first-generation, and students of color.
Yeah. I saw lots of nodding from Sue and Prudence. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I just really love the point that Lamont is making. I mean, of course, we're focused on Brown because we went there and we care a lot about the place and want to see it do well. And I'm fortunate enough to also work at a selective private higher education institution. But what the panelists are also talking about is that we need to think systemically about how to address the many ways in which the structural inequalities in our society essentially sort young people into opportunity channels, and sort of differently smooth the path to college for some and create hostile obstacles for others. And if the court rules against some of the tools many of us have been using to try to increase access to higher education, we fear, those of us who've been doing this kind of work fear that it will set us back in terms of the kind of social mobility that higher education traditionally has created a ladder for. I worry that the tools will make it harder for us to open up those channels of opportunity for very talented students who just simply happen to be born into under-resourced communities and are not getting a fair shot.
Yeah, Tracy, what I was thinking is that as Lamont was talking is I think we have like a multidimensional problem. There's the one of equal opportunity in higher ed as a conduit for social mobility for all and having that equitable opportunities for students from various backgrounds. But, I want to be real about the fact also that nobody is actually going to the Supreme Court to sue about certain levels or tiers of universities. This is a battle over the most elite, the most high status resources. And there's a reason why. It's because there's a master perception that the most elite are a certain type of capital that can be translated into even more status and more wealth and more esteem, right? And so there's a fight over or a battle over about, maybe 24 schools, maybe 40 to 50 schools. Meanwhile, there are thousands of colleges and universities in the country. But no one's going to court over those who would be ranked in the bottom tiers. And because of the master perception of what the elite schools can do for us in terms of the returns. Mm-hmm. And so, but on the other hand, we also have to worry about this other issue of making sure that we can keep colleges as a conduit and a central tool to mobility for students of all backgrounds. And so I think they're definitely interrelated. And the big question is, can the elite, the professional and managerial classes of the most elite universities train be representative of all people in the democracy and not just certain groups? That's the big question.
And then just a quick follow-up question. Are the most elite institutions also the ones that are going to be able to get creative around ways to still create the classes that they want to create? And are public schools and others not maybe going to have the same opportunities for that? Or am I making an incorrect assumption? Is there going to be a difference there among what people can do, what schools can do?
I don't know, because both of a public and a private, and this is what's really strategic about this, Brown and the other Ivies, if they have students who are receiving any public funds through Pell Grant programs, federal financial aid programs and such, they are subject to Title VI restrictions, right? And so if the courts rule in favor of the against Harvard and in favor of the petitioners, then this will be something that they will have to grapple with. And I think the public universities similarly under the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So they knew exactly what they were doing because we have both selective public and selective private universities that are a part of that constellation of elite. I mean, they're Ivy pluses, they're public and private Ivies, right? And so this is really what this is about. And
what may be true, Prudence, what do you think about this? What may be true is that the highest resource institutions may put more people and funds into creating a holistic admissions practice that has the time to read multiple essays about a student's experience, as opposed to treating applications, more like a Scantron. Like, in other words, the more highly resourced institutions may have an advantage in terms of being able to throw money at the admissions process to dig deeper into somebody's background than an application form may tell you about the applicant. And in that regard, it could be a strategic advantage for them in terms of assembling a diverse class. I'm just not sure whether they'll feel like they can do that depending on what the court rules.
Need some new tools of how to assess the background.
Right. Yep.
Well, we definitely saw this. I just one more point. I just came from the University of California, Berkeley, where I worked for several years. When Prop 209 came through, what California did see was a lot of students applying to the private universities, as opposed to, because they were more likely to get into the private universities than to Berkeley or UCLA, actually. Quite a few students were, because of the process. That's anecdotal.
So Lamont, I saw you. I just want to make sure you didn't have anything else to add as well.
No, the point I was going to make was made. Yep.
Okay, so thank you on that one. The next question we have is directed for Prudence, and it's really just about sort of what you've already done a little bit, but I really want you to focus on how, in general, is this going to affect impact both students' undergraduate experiences and their lives after college from a sociological perspective?
Well, I think the thing that when we all started with our personal stories of what drew us to this campus, it really saddens and it's disheartening to think that that could be really curtailed or reduced significantly. And I saw it on Berkeley's campus, so I know it can happen. And I think what we need to know is, there are many who argue about what do we value in this society. And why do we go to college? Mm-hmm. Do we go to college to be in an echo chamber so that we can just learn from people who share identities with us? Or do we go to really be pushed and expanded as human beings, as cultural actors, as participants and contributors to the society? And I think that's the thing that I worry more about, is what the long-term impact on who the movers and shakers of society will be. And they will come from various universities and colleges and such, but I do know that it will reduce the opportunities for certain groups if the Supreme Court goes in the way that we predict they would go. And that has an impact on the democracy, that has an impact on the shape of who is in the various spheres of our society running things. But more importantly, it has an impact on how we think critically and what kinds of students we're going to be producing. So I teach right now here at Brown. I even teach some of your kids probably, or I actually teach some class of 1990 children. And it's really fun to see that they're here now. And we were just talking about this morning. These students are being pushed because they come from varied backgrounds. I just can't imagine what it would be like when they don't have each other to push one another, because they'll become accustomed to segregation. They'll become accustomed to what we sociologists call homophily. Those are the same socioeconomic backgrounds, same communities. And so I think it would be pretty sad for the campus. I think it will be pretty sad for our students in terms of their ability to expand as thinkers and doers.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a highly segregated society. Most people grow up, and once they become adults, they live and work in highly segregated spaces. College is one of the opportunities to bring together a cross-section of the population, a diverse group, and during formative years of their sort of development, and give them the opportunity to just be exposed to new people, new ideas, new ways of thinking. And so the idea of not being able to be intentional about that and having less diversity on college campuses, it just feels like we're sort of going back to a time when college just sort of reinforced differences as opposed to helping students and young people learn and open and expand their minds.
And I would just add to that, that is the argument that prevailed in the Harvard case at the First Circuit. And actually, Ruth Simmons was an expert witness on behalf of Harvard. I think that was very impactful in that decision. It probably has very little chance with the Supreme Court of surviving, but that was a compelling argument at that level, because they did prevail in that instance.
I just want to interject a little bit. It's intentional though, because there is a certain faction of this country that does not want that cohort of the critical thinkers, because it means it has implications for the kinds of laws and practices, voting behavior, the political will to change things in this country for many others. And so the more we can actually create these kind of smaller echo chambers, like-minded people, you don't have the diversity of perspective, the more you can mitigate the possibility of people actually being empathic towards the outsider, the outgroup, the other, and being able to be more progressive in social policies and programs or supporting those. It's not just happening here in higher education, it is happening in K-12. Florida, Oklahoma, Texas. You can go across the country, 36 states. The anti kind of critical race theory, that's also a part of this whole constellation of turning us back, regressive politics, so that because it's a political action, it's a political move to really keep the country from going in certain directions. And it's very intentional, very strategic, and very sharp in some ways.
Absolutely. Okay. The next question is directed for Sue, and it is just in general, like, what is the long-term vision of colleges and universities that you know of when considering the realities facing our country and the world in terms of access to and the value of the undergraduate experience?
Well, I come back to Prudence's point about the importance of an educated population for having a thriving democracy. And I think many of us see with great trepidation what's happening right now in our country. We're living in kind of an anti-intellectual time where the very premise that a college education is important is being questioned. The value of a liberal arts education specifically is under a lot of pressure. If we look historically, the numbers of people who get a 4-year degree in the US hasn't really changed since we went to college more than 30 years ago. It's still only about 33 or 34% of the US population that gets a 4-year degree at any kind of institution. And that's a really small number. And so when I think about, the future of higher education, the importance of it, obviously I'm working at a small liberal arts college, so it's important for me to be able to articulate a narrative about the value proposition, right? We're not giving students at a place like Brown, we're not giving students a certificate to get a job. We're giving them a toolkit to have a variety of careers, probably in their lifetime. That's what the economy looks like, and to be engaged participants in our democracy. So this is why I feel so passionately that it's incumbent upon all of us who care about access to higher education to do everything we can to lower barriers to get access. And that means, we're seeing this now. We're seeing examples, eliminating application fees, going test optional. We're saying we're not going to look at test scores at all, doing holistic admission practices, partnering with talent identification programs like College Visions, where Lamont works, or College Track or College Possible or the Posse Foundation. There are a lot of ways in which higher ed institutions can cooperate with partners in order to identify talented students and give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. And my fear is that if we don't push against this resistance we're encountering now, we're going to continue to actually narrow or shrink the percentage of the US population that does have the kind of education a place like, let's just say any higher education at all. But I mean, I'm grateful for the education I got at Brown. If we're shrinking from 35% of the US population, smaller and smaller the number of people who have a degree, then all those tools we got, the critical thinking, the effective communication, persuasive argumentation, ability to work in teams with people different than we are, all that stuff that makes you successful in life, we're denying 2/3 of the population access to that. And I think we need to do everything we can to reverse that trend.
Agreed. And you brought up standardized tests and the test optional policy, which I think touches on this. As a K-12 person, obviously we're inundated with standardized tests, which absolutely degrades the kind of education we're able to give to students, particularly students in underserved communities. So my question is, what have we seen? I mean, we know that test optional policies have at least increased diversity during the COVID times. Are there other ways other than standardized tests to sort of, as the number of applications come into these universities with like double, triple the numbers? We were talking earlier, are there ways other than standardized tests that we can kind of comb through them for things that we really want to be looking for, especially?
Well, there are a couple things going on there, Tracy. I mean, the number of applications at elite schools is going up and up and up, but that's not because the number of applicants is increasing. In fact, we're headed toward a demographic cliff in 2026. The number of 18 to 22-year-olds in the US is going to contract by as much as 20%. And that's because after the last economic downturn in 2008, people stopped having kids and it didn't really pick back up again. So the number of students is shrinking. You know what's increasing is the pressure on that smaller number of kids to apply like a nuclear arms race to 14, 15, 16, 20 colleges. And that's why the most selective places are getting inundated with applications, 40,000, 50,000 applications. But it's not that the number of students is actually going up. So I think the more important thing for us to pay attention to is how do we get each student to a place that is right for them, gives them what they need to succeed, which, for low income and first gen students, is going to mean not just letting them in and covering room and board and tuition, but all the wraparound services that make it possible to compete on a more level playing field with students who had every advantage in the world, and also to feel a sense of belonging when they join a college community.
Sue, I think that's a really good, that's an excellent point. And Lamont, I'm really curious about what you would think about what would it take in the ecosystem of higher ed to get parents in this country to realize that there are so many other opportunities and they don't have to pressure their kids to go to 16 to 20 different schools. What kinds of partnerships could be built? How could we broaden and spread out the resources so that all the pressure is not on these 20 schools or so?
Yeah, I think, what's interesting, another set of colleges that has seen a really huge increase in applications is HBCUs, right? And that's because we hear much more about HBCUs in the media. They're much more visible. Some of this has to do with, in the wake of George Floyd and the protests around Black Lives Matter. But because of the visibility, those colleges are getting many more applications. So I think it's about the visibility. And again, and pretty much every conversation we have, it's always focused on a very small subset of colleges. But the more we highlight the value of education at a range of schools and the alumni who go to some of these schools, I think that puts some of these schools on the radar of students.
Yeah, that's good.
We have a question in the chat if we want to start taking on questions from our friends. How hard will it be for this to be enforced? Will admissions discussions have to be made public? And how will that impact school autonomy? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not quite sure what the it is.
And we don't know what the it is. That's part of the
I think
conversation. I mean, it's highly speculative. We don't know what the decision will be. It could, how narrow or how exactly what it will focus on. So it's a little hard to answer that question.
I think, we can make some educated guesses about the possibilities that would range everything from you simply can't have a question about race on your application. That would be one interpretation, all the way to things like you can no longer give a scholarship that's designated to a female student or to a first gen student or to a Black student, or really based on any kind of identity, to things like you can't have clubs. You can't have a, TWTP. You can't have houses that are based on affinity group. You can't have alumni affinity groups. It's just not clear how far the ruling is going to go. And so then, depending on that, enforcement will become trickier and trickier, I think. And just imagine all the places that have millions of dollars in their endowments that are tied up in identity-specific scholarships that potentially could be undone or nullified, and then having to go back and figure out how to unwind that. So in some cases, the donors are no longer even alive. It's super complicated.
I think that another thing that's interesting about this question, Gail, is even if there are alternative practices, there are controlling and prevailing stereotypes about who's supposed to be in these kinds of institutions, right? And so if the universities were to maintain a certain demographic distribution, or even do better or greater, they will immediately be under the microscope. And someone will want to interrogate what the admissions practices are. So this is what my concern is. There's now a perception, and it is so deeply entrenched. And this is the problem with affirmative action. as it was bastardized. Because when it came out in the 1960s, this was not the intention. It was to affirm that people historically excluded had the right to equal educational opportunity. That included women and peoples of color. And now it's used as this term for code, like less competent or less capable or whatever. Mm-hmm. I am fairly sure that I'm an affirmative action baby. Mm-hmm. I came from the state of Mississippi to Brown, but I was also a high achieving student. And but how many people applied to Brown out of Mississippi? How many people applied to Brown out of Idaho or North Dakota or Montana? How many people apply who are piccolo players? There are so many reasons why, but we are using this. So what I'm worried about is that even if we were to come up with alternative practices to maintain the values and the mission, there is a dominant, controlling narrative about who's more high achieving and who's supposed to be here. And so that the universities will be under the microscope no matter what. And I hate to be pessimistic about it, but until we can annihilate those dominant stereotypes and get away from that in terms of the framing nationally, they're going to be suits every so many years. That's what I fear. I didn't mean to shut it down.
No, you didn't shut it down. I think people are just taking it in, processing. But friends out there, if you do have any additional questions, we are looking at the chat. I think we did talk about how it could potentially impact scholarships, but that's in there. Did we talk about that a bit?
Well, maybe I just need to explain what I meant. If a donor gives $1 million to a college or university and says, I want this to be in an endowment and the interest that it generates every year should go to a scholarship to support X kind of students. If whatever the X kind of student is found to be a group that the court says we can't in any way take into consideration, then the question is, can we differentially give a scholarship to X group, whether that is, tennis players or Latino students? It's just because we don't know how far reaching the court's decision is going to go. We don't know how limited we may be, but it's possible that they could say you can't disperse scholarships differentially based on race. Well, many, many colleges and universities have been given gifts by generous donors to help expand access to college by making scholarship dollars specifically available for various historically excluded groups.
Okay, so we have another question. What are your colleges, universities doing to prepare? I know my university has a task force that is trying to game out the potential decisions and ramifications, since changes may have to happen very quickly.
Yeah, so I could start on that. I think same basically at Brown. We have had transition to provost's office this year, but that's really where the leadership has been from. There actually is an article in the BDH this week where some of my colleagues in admissions and general counsel and vice president for institutional equity and diversity spoke to students about various scenarios. They are pretty speculative. I mean, because I think there's some tea leaf reading from the oral arguments and from other decisions this court has made and directions and probably all the systemic things that Prudence has so articulately described. Probably have a pretty good sense of where things are going to end up, but until you actually see the decision, as several people have said, it's not known. But absolutely, and I think this is happening at any institution that would expect to have to adjust its practices, exactly that kind of scenario planning. But I think there'll be a lot of scrambling in July, assuming this follows a pattern of being a mid to late June decision. And then also depending on what kind of time frame, if any, they put in place around it, and direction. And some of it, I would go back to something I share the concerns that Prudence was describing, and I think that this will spawn years of other types of lawsuits and Office of Civil Rights investigations. Now, we do deal with that all the time now. We are highly regulated in a wide variety of ways, and one of the ones I've spent a lot of time on over many years is around sexual assault and sexual violence, and our policies and procedures to be both compliant with Title IX and to try and impact student behavior and student culture. And that is frequently shaped by interpretations of regulations, which are not always clear and oftentimes inconsistent, change with presidential administrations and change in leadership at the department, and then can also be impacted by individual lawsuits and other things that happen. So that's making that kind of a risk assessment in how far you can push and how where you can be along a spectrum, particularly with a court decision that's going to be hundreds of pages with dissenting opinions and a variety of different ways people will interpret it. I think that's not uncommon for the world that we live in.
Well, I think one of the things that we can do as alumni that may be on the task force list is to think about how we can actually grow and embolden our alumni interviewing process, strengthening that, how many more foot soldiers we can get out in the high schools and communities to help the admissions team. It may be amping up travel. So I did Brown admissions after we graduated. I was an admission officer for 2 years here at Brown, and I covered seven states for the university. And I made it a point of going into the central cities, from the central cities to the vastest boarding school campuses. I did it all. And that's what propelled me to study what I study. But I wonder if we're going to just have to do more travel and also really call on our alumni, if for those who may be committed to the mission and the value, because what Brown gave us, we want the future to have that too. So I think these are the kinds of things that we just will have to be creative about how to keep Brown so fabulous, because we think, we want other folks to have that experience. So.
I love that, Prudence, paying it forward. Absolutely. We have probably time for one last question, and there is one in the chat. How would this change work with new accreditation standards on DEI, which is, of course, diversity, equity, inclusion? And I don't know, do we think that will change in terms of, probably need to?
Well, I think that just like the testing enterprise is being called into question right now as schools are becoming test optional or even test blind, meaning you're not even allowed to submit testing scores. And that's really calling into question that whole sector. I think similarly, a lot of accrediting bodies are watching this very closely because many of them have invested significant time and effort to create DEI standards for accreditation that may themselves be ruled problematic depending on what happens with this case. So many of the professional meetings I've been going to in the last year where other college and university presidents are gathering, the accreditors also are there. And they're all having the same kind of conversations we're having on the Zoom call. What if? If they do this, then we could do that. And everyone's trying to be creative. But it is, I agree, will be a challenge to a lot of accrediting bodies also. How could they hold us to a standard that's been deemed illegal?
Yes.
Yeah, I could add to that a little bit. I chair the New England Commission on Higher Education, which is the accrediting body for our region. Accrediting bodies are no longer regional, but mostly it's New England institutions. So many of the highly selective institutions are within our, among our membership. And I would definitely agree with everything Sue said. I do think that the accreditation, at least in the New England approach to it, is very much based on mission of the institution and covers a wide range of institutions with very different missions. And I think it's possible that there may be some things we have to adapt, but I don't think it will, undermine accreditation, in any fundamental way. I think it will adapt, just like the institutions will have to adapt. I think the front lines of this will be on the institutions themselves rather than from an accreditation perspective.
So it is 8:59, and I do want to respect the time of our panelists and all of you. I have to give a huge thank you to all four of you, Sue, Prudence, Lamont, and Russell. Thank you so much for your time and for all the work you put into this and all the work you do all the time in your higher education careers. And to our classmates, I just want to let you know this is the first forum of a brand new series that we're calling Class Connections in our efforts as a class to re-engage a broader cross-section of our alumni friends. So we all love a good reunion and a good party, but we also think there are topical points and issues that we'd like to come together and discuss in the future. I think for sure we'll be doing a follow-up after the Supreme Court decision comes out, so we can actually answer some of these questions more thoroughly, but also there will be more topics. So if you enjoyed tonight, there will be a link. It was recorded. We invite you to tell your friends and forward them the link if you'd like, and hopefully come back for the next one. So thank you all so much. Appreciate you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ever true.
Ever true.
Ever true.